All right, so this video lecture will be over the booklet Aristotle's Metaphysics, the Four Causes. Now, as a way forward into this material, let's first consider this very famous painting of the ancient philosophers in Athens by the Italian Renaissance artist Raphael, called The School of Athens. And who do you notice here at the very center of the painting, those two central philosophers in the foreground? All right, it's Plato and Aristotle. And more, what do you think it means that the two philosophers are pointing in opposite directions? Plato upward toward the heavens and Aristotle down toward the earth. Well, it represents their very different approaches to metaphysics. More specifically, it represents their different theories on the nature of form and its relationship to matter. As Brian McGee notes, right, the author of the text for this section of class, or for Aristotle's Metaphysics, as McGee notes, Aristotle founded a new approach to philosophy, right, a philosophical method that starts not from abstract arguments and a priori knowledge, but rather from observation and experience, right? Begins from this world here that we live in and experience. So in other words, Aristotle rejected something fundamental to Plato's philosophy. He rejected the idea that there are two distinct orders of reality, or two different regions of being. Right? Remember, Plato argued that it was not really possible to acquire genuine knowledge about the always changing, never remaining the same physical world. Nonetheless, Plato argued there are objects of genuine knowledge, namely the forms or the ideas, and we've come to refer to these as the Platonic forms, right? Like the form of beauty itself, as opposed to the many particular beautiful things which we encounter here through our senses in the visible physical world. Or, the form of horseness itself, as opposed to the many particular horses that we encounter and experience in the material, visible, physical world. Or the form of threeness itself, as opposed to the many different sets of three things in the physical world. Now, of course, these Platonic forms are not just ideas that exist in the mind, right? They aren't merely the names that we've come up with in order to group similar things together under one category. Rather, the forms, like beauty itself, are actually existing entities. They just inhabit an abstract, non-sensible, eternal realm that's outside of space and time. Now, we do, however, come to know the forms through the mind, right? Through the intellect, because again, you cannot touch or see beauty itself. You cannot touch or see or sense the Platonic forms. You can only grasp them with your mind, through reason, through the intellect. To use the very familiar example, like from a couple of lectures ago, there will never be an edition of National Geographic that declares, finally, explorers discover the number 3 hiding in the Himalayas, right? 3 is an abstract concept. We can represent it with a symbol, but threeness itself, like the idea of a perfect triangle itself, is not something which exists here in the physical, visible world or realm. Now, contrary to Plato, Aristotle argues that there is only one world that we can philosophize about, right? And it's the world down here, the world that we actually experience. And so from this standpoint, Aristotle is pretty dismissive of the Platonic forms. But, at the same time, Aristotle's theory of form does not totally ditch all of Plato's hypotheses, but we'll return to that here in a moment. For now, let's consider some of the background and biography on Aristotle. Now, just as Plato had been a pupil of Socrates, Aristotle was Plato's pupil. And he was born in the ancient city of Stagira in 384 BC. And then at 17, he was sent to Plato's academy in Athens. Fast forward a few decades, when he's adult, Aristotle travels to Macedonia, where he tutors Alexander the Great. So there's actually a sort of direct line of succession through 4 generations of important world historical figures who've shaped Western history and culture: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Alexander. Okay, Fast forward a few more decades, and Plato dies. Aristotle then returns to Athens, where he founded his own school at the Athenian Lyceum, which was the sort of local gymnasium. Now, when he was 62 years old, the Athenians charged Aristotle with the crime of impiety, just as they had charged Socrates 80 years earlier. Yet, unlike his intellectual grandfather, Socrates, who stood trial and was executed by the state, Aristotle fled Athens, saying as he goes, "I will not allow Athens to sin against philosophy a second time." Now, Aristotle's influence on Western knowledge and civilization cannot be overstated. Our world is still in many ways the product of Aristotle's ideas. For instance, Aristotle mapped out for the first time the most basic areas of study. And from his work in these fields, it actually provided the names that are still used today, right? We refer to logic, physics, political science, and economics. These are concepts and names that Aristotle employed, right? Along with psychology, metaphysics, rhetoric, and ethics. More, he invented the technical terms, the oftentimes very central technical terms in those fields of study that have been used ever since, right? Some of which include energy and substance, induction, right, in the case of logic, or property in the case of metaphysics, and universal and essence also. On top of all this, Aristotle systematized logic, and his system of logic prevailed for nearly 2,000 years. As McGee notes, the human race was not to produce a thinker of Aristotle's caliber for another 2,000 years. Indeed, it is doubtful whether any human being has ever known as much as he did. Okay, so let's move on to Aristotle's metaphysics and the very kind of heady, abstract question of being and existence. The question of the meaning of being was the key question for Aristotle. For instance, what is being? What is it simply to be, and what is it to be something, right? Now, the meaning of being, as opposed to non-being, seems so obvious that we rarely ever think to ask the question of its meaning, right? The meaning of being. Yet, when we really take a step back and ponder the nature of being, we find that the sensible answer to these questions is increasingly difficult to grasp. So, for example, when I say of something simply that it is, am I referring to the same manner of being or existence when I say of something that it is X, right? That it is an instance of X, like it is a person or it is a table, etc., etc. Now, in grammar, we call this latter form of being predication, right? It's when we attribute or predicate a property to a subject. So, for example, when I say of the object in front of me, the chalice is, am I using is similarly or differently than when I say the thing in front of me is a chalice, right? The point here is like, what's the difference? Not in terms of grammar, but in terms of the nature of being. Is it the same or is it different in these two particular examples? Consider again the problem of being's apparent non-being. So when I say the chalice is, right, that physical thing which gets signified by the word chalice, it must have being and existence, right? I mean, I can point to it. Here it is, the chalice existing right in front of me. But what in the world does the word is refer to in that sentence, right? Does it refer to something which also exists, right? It's not really clear that it does. I mean, it seems like it most certainly isn't referring to something which exists, right? And so being, we might think, is a thing which is, but when we think about it, right, it actually seems quite obvious that we don't want to confuse being, which is not a thing, with beings, which are things, namely things which exist. So I guess it's the case that being is a non-being. Well, that quite can't be right either, right? How can being at the same time be non-being, right? So the question we see is like full of deep and penetrating inexplicability, the nature of being and the meaning of being. And so perhaps it would all be much simpler if we adopt a very kind of simplistic metaphysics that says, well, everything that exists is ultimately just matter, right? Some sort of physical stuff. That's all that exists, right? The stuff that we can perceive, the stuff that we can sense, the stuff that we can behold. In other words, right, we're asking, is the ontological theory of materialism true, right? The view that only matter, only physical stuff exists. Well, okay, how does Aristotle answer this question of ontological or metaphysical materialism? And as we saw from the reading, Aristotle rejects any sort of crude materialism, right? In Aristotle's metaphysics, the things that exist are not simply the matter out of which they are composed. So to the question, what exists in the world, the answer is not only matter or only physical stuff. And so we can think about the booklet, right? What was the first example used to explain Aristotle's rejection of materialism? And it was that example dealing with the nature of the being of a house. So if the construction company unloaded on your yard all of the bricks and the beams and the so on, and then said, okay, here's your house, that's going to be a problem, right? Because a house is much more than the constituent materials out of which it's made, right? So in order for that material to be a house, it would all need to be arranged and structured in a distinct way, because it's by virtue of the arrangement of the material that it is a house and not merely a pile of material stuff, right? Clearly, to be a house, something must be more than just the material, right? It's not the material that makes it a house. It's the structure, it's the form, right? And then the second example that's used to reject materialism is the nature of the being of a human person, right? So take the person of Socrates, for example. The matter of which Socrates' body is made, right, is constantly changing every day. And it changes entirely every few years. Yet Socrates, nonetheless, goes on being the same Socrates. So we can't possibly assert that Socrates is the same thing as the material out of which his body is made. And then Aristotle extends this argument to the species of things. So consider the being, or consider the nature of the being that is a dog. In an argument similar to Plato's, Aristotle asks, what is it that makes all the different kinds of dogs? What is it that makes them all dogs? And what makes them all dogs is not the fact that all dogs share the same distinctive material, right? Flesh, blood, and bone, because many species of animal have flesh, blood, and bone, right? Rather, it's the distinctive arrangement of that flesh, blood, and bone that makes them dogs and distinguishes them from other animals that are similarly composed of flesh and blood and bone. All right, so Aristotle's theory of form argues against metaphysical materialism, and it establishes that a thing is, whatever it is, by virtue of its structure. That is to say, by virtue of its form. In his metaphysics, physical being is a compound of matter and form. So, in other words, Aristotle argues, much like Plato, that to know or to comprehend the nature of the being of a physical thing, we have to know its form, because its form is what kind of reveals its essence or its nature. Yet we don't want to forget that Aristotle rejected Plato's theory of forms, right? Because he denied that form was an abstract entity existing outside of space and outside of time. That nonetheless causes things to be what they are, right? For Aristotle, form must remain this worldly. So, okay, if it's neither material nor totally ideal, then what exactly is the nature of form for Aristotle? Okay, so here's the definition of Aristotelian form that you'll need to know. Form is the ultimate essence of a thing, which is expressed by that thing's matter being arranged in a way that enables it to fulfill its distinctive function or purpose, and thus causes it to be the sort of thing that it is. So that's a complex definition, so let's break it down. First and foremost, Aristotle, not unlike his teacher, argues that form is what causes a thing to be what it is. And it's Aristotle's understanding of the link between being and form that leads Aristotle to break down form into different sorts of causes, right? And he outlines 4 of them. There's the material cause of something, what it's made of, right? There's the efficient cause of something, what actually makes or arranges it. There's the formal cause of something, right? What gives it the shape by which it fulfills its function and by which it can be identified. And then the final, or the functional cause, right? The ultimate reason for its existence. And it's helpful to think of Aristotle's 4 causes as the, quote, be causes of something, right? In other words, they are the causes of a thing's being what it is. So let's consider the essence or the being of a chalice. The nature of the being of the chalice is the arrangement, right, the form of the silver, which is the matter, right, that enables the chalice to fulfill its function, right, which is to hold liquid. That's its final cause. And of course, the efficient cause of the thing being a chalice is that silversmith who arranged all of that matter into that particular form, which allowed it to perform its function and its purpose. All right, so to define explicitly the 4 causes of being for Aristotle, right, we've got the material cause, what the thing is made of, in other words, its material constituents. Then secondly, you have the formal cause, the arrangement of the material stuff that allows the thing to be known and identified and that allows it to fulfill its function. Then you have the efficient cause, right? The thing that actually makes or arranges the material stuff, right? That could be a craftsman if it's an artifact, or it could be a force of nature if it's something natural and organic. And then lastly, there's the final or functional cause, right? It's the ultimate reason for the thing's existence, its function or its purpose. So for one last example for this lecture, we can consider the being of a table, the nature of the being of a table. And so for Aristotle, the table is being what it is because of the material out of which it's made. And what's that? Well, the wood. Next, the wooden table is being what it is because of the form that gives that material stuff an identity as something, and the form which enables the table to perform its function, right? Namely, it's being a flat surface that sits on 4 legs. Also, the wooden table is being what it is because of the process that arranged its matter into that form which was necessary to fulfill its purpose. Namely, it's being crafted by a carpenter into the appropriate arrangement. And lastly is the final cause of the table, its purpose, right, for which it was brought into existence. It's being a place for the serving and eating of food. So Aristotle, for Aristotle's metaphysics, unlike Plato's, right, form is not something material. Rather, form is not something ideal, right? But also it's not something material. Form is inherent in this worldly object, right? As McGee says, form for Aristotle can no more exist separately from matter than a man's build can exist separately from his body. All right, so these lecture notes are also up online, and that's it for this lecture. And check D2L for the rest of the lecture notes corresponding to this section of class.